Hello everyone, I am Liz Tilley from the Open University and I'm here today with Simon Jarrett to talk about the article we've written for the British Journal of Learning Disabilities on the history of learning disability. Over to you, Simon.
And I'm Simon Jarrett. I recently wrote a book about the history of learning disability over the last 300 years and co-wrote this article with Liz. And Liz is just going to tell you a bit about why we wrote the article.
Thank you, Simon. So in the short film, we just want to let you know a little bit about why we came to write this article and how we came to write it. And we'll tell you a little bit about what we say in the article. I think the first thing to say really is that Simon and I are both passionate about history. So we're both historians by background. And we are really interested in the question of why does history matter to people with learning disabilities and the people that support them. We've both done our own research in the area of learning disability history. So my own research, for example, covers quite a recent period of history and looks at the start of the self-advocacy movement. Simon, on the other hand, has done work that reaches much further back in time, exploring the lives of people with learning disabilities from the 18th century, which was more than 300 years ago. So that gives you an indication of our own interests. But Simon and I are also both really interested in why other people have chosen to do research in the history of learning disability. And that got us thinking about when did that interest start? When did people start thinking about and writing about the history of learning disability, and what were people focusing on? So really, the article that we've written is our attempt to tell the story of the history of learning disability. So I'm going to pass to Simon now, because actually the beginnings of this article really began many years ago when Simon presented at a conference at the Open University, where, Simon, I remember you first introducing this idea about the history of the history. Could you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it all came about because to begin my research, one of the things that I felt I had to do was read what everyone else had written about the history of learning disability so that I understood where I was coming from and where I stood in the context of other historians and so on. What became very interesting to me when I read through everything everybody else had written was how much the writing of history changes over time. And I talked about different waves of history, different types of history that people were writing, which were very influenced by the time they lived in, the society they lived in, the views and assumptions that people had at that time. And so that's what led to the presentation which I made all those years ago, and to the article that Liz and I have just written.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So you spoke there about this idea of waves, the different waves of history. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the first wave, because in the article we talk about three sort of clear waves and a possible fourth that we'll come to. But could you just say a little bit more about that first wave?
Yeah, the first wave's really interesting, and I call it the medical wave. And so when you look back at the early histories of learning disability, they were nearly all written by doctors, psychiatrists, people from the medical world. And really, they were about the history of medicine, and they were about the history of what those doctors and psychiatrists had done. And so really, the history of learning disabilities was about people with learning disabilities as sort of creatures of the institutions that doctors and psychiatrists ran, and they didn't really have a history outside that time. The history was all about the great achievements of medical practitioners rather than about people with learning disabilities themselves.
That's really interesting. And then, of course, the next wave, the second wave that we talk about, which we describe in the article as the social history of learning disability, takes on quite a different flavour then, doesn't it? Because in that second wave, this is really when historians get interested in the stories and the voices of people with learning disabilities themselves and their families and their supporters. So in the second wave, historians don't lose interest in the medical stories and the institute, but the shift there is around how do we enable people with learning disabilities to tell their own stories, and that seemed to be a big, quite a notable feature of that social history that really seemed to take off in the 1990s, and of course is very tied up with the founding of the Social History of Learning Disability group at the Open University, and certainly challenges, I think, some of those earlier histories and presents a different perspective.
Yes, that's right. That second wave of social history was a very big turnaround from the first wave of medical history, and started to give a voice to people with learning disabilities in the telling of their own history. And that takes us on to the third wave, as we've described it, which is what we call the cultural wave. And what that's really doing is it moves a bit on from the social history, and it talks about learning disability as being an idea, not a fact, not something that's exactly the same, whichever century you look in, but that it's an idea that societies have about different groups of people. And that's why we've had all this different terminology over the centuries, some of it, as we know, very offensive and abusive, and ranging from idiots through mental defectives, mental handicap, learning disability, and so on. And in cultural history, that's seen as the idea of learning disability being a product, something that happens in a particular society at a particular time, and then changes according to people's attitudes and assumptions. So that's really the third big wave we look at, and I'd say that the history I write is part of that wave, and I think some of what you write, Liz, is part of that too. But as we were doing this article, we identified what we thought was a fourth wave.
You did, and I think, well, I think Simon and I both feel this is quite an exciting development. It's reasonably recent, although there are examples that do stretch back a few years. But this is about people with learning disabilities themselves taking on the role of historians and researching and leading the history research themselves. So identifying the sort of research and the projects they want to do, and really taking ownership of that. And I think this is really interesting because in the main, in those first three waves, I think the history was predominantly undertaken by people without learning disabilities. So this fourth wave is interesting, and lots of people, well, a few people in the fourth wave are calling themselves historian activists. And I just wanted to give a quote that we do include in the article, which is from Paul Christian, who's somebody who does describe himself as a historian activist. And he says, "I like the term, like if you know your history, you can use it." And Simon and I think this is a really important quote, because what Paul's saying here really does get to the heart, I think, of the article that we've written, which is making the point that history isn't something that just happens and then sits on a shelf. History is something that can be used. And I think what some of the people who are doing research in this fourth wave are saying is history can be a tool for change. So I think that this is an interesting development, and I'm sure we'll see more of it in the coming years.
Absolutely. I think we're both very excited, and I think a lot of people are very excited about how things are developing in learning disability history. And I think, just to sum up from the article that we both wrote, it's sometimes just as important to look at how a historian writes what they write, and why they write what they write, and how much that's related to the beliefs and assumptions that they have, and the society that they live in has. And so the writing of history is just as much a part of the history as the history itself.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon. We hope you enjoy the article. Thank you.